Hi, welcome to some ideas to use 20 fat quarters. So I'm Susan Clare, GourmetQuilter, and we're running various different programs, and this one we're going to be doing 20 different ideas to use 20 fat quarters for. So I started out with a stack of 20 fat quarters and I've been cutting them up into different projects. This is one of the projects here. So if you're interested, there's more information on the website. There's a pattern that you can purchase. It's a downloadable pattern, and each idea is coming each day for 20 days, and the pattern will be available each day for 20 days with the video, etc. So in your pattern, if you're going to receive the pattern, we start, as I said, we're starting out with 20 fat quarters, but we're adding some other fabrics like borders and bindings and one or two other little bits and pieces here and there, of course backings and batting as well. So it's not all quilts, but it will be some of quilts, some other little small projects. So in the pattern, when you receive it, you'll find that there's some general information on how we go about doing some of the sewing. There's a couple of charts in there that show you how you might want to cut up fat quarters into squares and strips. There's two charts, one for fat quarter yards and one for meters. We use meters here, but I know a lot of the world use yards. So, and they're slightly different sizes. So that's all in the pattern as well. And then we have also, because I'm using the 20 fat quarters throughout, so this is going to be our first project, this Tablerunner here, and it has a piece of each of the 20 fat quarters in it, as well as a background and a binding. So I've used white and I've used the little stripe, the black and white stripe quite often. I'm using a batik cloth, which always goes together so nicely. So you can see that I've used a little piece of each of the 20 fat quarters in that one project. So we'll be doing quite a bit of that in the project. So in order to be able to do that, we need to know how to cut the fat quarters so that that will work for us. Because if we just haphazardly cut into them, we'll find that we won't be able to get some of the other pieces out. So in the pattern there is a chart that shows you. So generally speaking, we're working on a fat quarter usable area being 17 inches along the selvage by 21 inches which is half the width of the fabric, which normally is just a little bit more than that. So that's a little bit tight, but usually I've never had trouble getting that much out of a fat quarter. So it's a fat quarter yard. So on here, what I'm suggesting is that we layer them maybe 5 at a time, if you're happy to cut through 5, whatever you're comfortable cutting through. And we're going to be slicing them initially into strips. So there's some strip sizes here so that we're cutting. So this would be the selvage, and we'll be cutting the strips, and then we'll be cutting down within the strips there, and labelling everything. So there's a sheet of labels so that everything is clearly labelled. It tells you a number, and which is like a code number, and the size and number of pieces. So pretty much 20 for everything. Sometimes there's more than 20 if we need 2 of a shape the same size in the same project. It might say 40, like this one here says 40, and that sort of thing. So initially, to get started, I found that it works really well if you're able to with a long ruler so that you can cut through the 21 inches all in one go. If you can't, that's fine. You'll know how you can cut your fabric, but I found that works for me. So what I've done is I've lined everything up. I have actually just trimmed this edge, but I've got all my selvages so that they're sitting together, and as much as possible everything else, all the edges. So I've pressed them all, and when I press them, I iron them on top of each other. So I've got 5 fat quarters there, and they vary a little bit in size, but they're not too different. And so my first cut is 5.5 inches for a strip, so I'm just going to line that up. I use the markings on my board quite a lot. Now it is quite a long cut, so your ruler may want to slip and slide. You may have something that helps with that. Sometimes a little bit of some sticky sandpaper dots work really well, or you just need to keep the pressure fairly even on it. So when it's that long, have a nice sharp blade because you're cutting through several layers. You can just move your hand further along so that it doesn't slip and slide, and you get that nice strip cut off. And then the next cut we can do as well in exactly the same way. So just if you leave everything sitting where it is and cut your strips first, and then you can cut from the strips and label as you go. Now if you're not sure that you're applying enough pressure before you take the ruler up, you can always run it through a second time, because just occasionally a little thread will catch. with the cutting. So I won't keep going there because I think that's fairly clear now. The sizes are all in the pattern. And so on this larger piece here, when I'm going to cut the other way, now I'm going to turn it round and most likely use a shorter ruler because I find that long one quite cumbersome for shortcuts. So I've still got all my selvages together. I'm going to be trimming them off. So you do need to make sure you have got 21 inches of fabric as well as trimming off the selvage. And then, as I said, in general, you will have, it may not be a lot more, but you will have enough. So I would start by trimming off my selvage, and then I would come along by the measurements on that chart, and I would start cutting them this way. And then I've got my labels, so I know that this one here is actually going to go with this lot here because I'll put it in that order. Because I've already cut some of my fat quarters, I haven't cut them all yet. So I can just make sure that I've got all 20 of my one size in that label. So I think that's fairly clear as to how we're going to go about doing all that. If you get all that done at the beginning and have everything labelled, like I've got all my little pieces labelled here, that will help you later on with the projects as we get to them. So now we can get to project number 1. So project number 1, even though I haven't actually finished cutting everything just yet, I can show you how to get started because I've got the sample up behind me. So as I said, I'm using this stripe for my binding. So I've cut my binding strips, I've cut my border strips, and there's some little squares on the end of these little rectangles here. So quite straightforward for sewing. This was my label for these pieces. Now I put them together colour-wise fairly randomly. I did make sure that I didn't have the two reds sitting right next to each other and things like that, but overall I didn't pay a lot of attention to what went where. So you'll have 20 of these because there's 20 fat quarters and there's 20 squares to go with them, and so you can just chain piece these through. So each of these rectangles will have a square on the end, and then we're going to just top and tail them basically for putting it together. So you could just chain piece these through fairly readily, and then we can press them and join them up into a row. So I think it's a really effective little table runner. When I do something like this with all the fat quarters, the fat quarters do have patterns on them, but they're not heavily patterned. They're largely about colour rather than the pattern. A little bit of pattern is nice to give a bit of variation, but not entirely about pattern. So I think have a little think about that when you're choosing your fat quarters. You may prefer to have different fabrics that are more patterned than this, and of course that's your choice. These are my preferred ones, so this is what I'm using. So it's really simple. So you would do all 20 of them to do the table runner, and then we're just going to press the seams, and I've pressed them into the colour because I'm using white, and where possible I don't have the seam in the white, although it's not always possible not to have. And so it doesn't take too long to make this little one. This is a kind of a fun, fairly fast little project. So having got all 20 to this stage, then you're just going to put them together simply by turning one around the other way and then stitching that together. So we'll stitch one together just so that you can see for sure. I'm sure you know how to do this by now already. So some of the projects are a little bit more involved. So you could just go ahead now, you could sew them together in pairs and then join the pairs together, etc., to make the full length, and then they just need to be pressed. And I'll just press the seam to one side, and so you'd end up making your whole row that looks a whole lot like this sort of thing. And then we can put their borders on the end, so we've got two end strips that will go on the end, we've got two longer strips that will be our long edge borders, and then once we've done that we can put batting and batting behind it and we can quilt it. And all I've done for the quilting, I've kept it super simple, is just some straight parallel lines. So I've just got a lightweight cotton batting in there. I love the cotton batting, particularly for table runners and things where I want things to sit flat on a table. I've just got a fairly plainish back on there. And I've just simply done straight stitching. If you have a dual feed or walking foot or something like that on your machine, that's really helpful because it just helps it feed nicely. And I've just stitched approximately 1/2 inch apart, parallel lines across the width all the way. And then I trimmed it up, and then I've put a binding on. And I know that you know how to do a binding, but in the pattern there are instructions for binding, or I've done several other videos with bindings, so that tells you all about that. So I think for a starting idea, that's a whole lot of fun. It's very achievable. So if you're going to sew along with the series, go ahead, get your 20 fat quarters, get them all cut and labelled, and then we can be making these projects as we go. Have some background fabrics, maybe some binding. Something like a little stripe is kind of effective. Sometimes it's used in the quilt as well with some of the things that we'll be doing, so that it sort of draws it in. Sometimes it's just like this one on the edge. Sometimes there's a couple of other things that we might need too, but mostly not a lot other than some backgrounds and bindings. So enjoy the projects, please, and I enjoy seeing you here, and I will be back again with Fat Quarter idea number 2.